Imagine waking up before sunrise in a world with no heating, no GPS, no grocery store, no phone, and a temperature so low that the moisture in your breath freezes before it hits the ground. You have no sleeping bag, no synthetic insulation, and the closest thing to a doctor is a woman in the next valley who knows which roots keep infection from turning fatal. You have nothing but your hands, your knowledge, and what the land around you is willing to give. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday morning for our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago, and not just for a few extraordinary individuals, but for every man, woman, and child who wanted to see spring. What they developed to survive is not primitive. It is not simple. It is a body of knowledge so sophisticated, so carefully tested across generations of life or death feedback, that modern survival experts and anthropologists are still uncovering layers of it that leave them genuinely stunned. In this video, we are going to walk through 20 of those forgotten skills, starting with the ones that kept bodies alive through blizzards, and ending with the one technique that ancient humans used above all others that modern people have almost entirely lost. Number 3 on this list involves a material you almost certainly have in your home right now, and number 7 will completely change how you think about fire. Number 1 is the skill that tied everything else together, and when you understand it, you will never look at winter the same way again. If you are new here, consider subscribing before we begin, because this channel goes deep into the knowledge that kept humanity alive before the modern world made us forget it. Number 20 is reading snow the way others read a map. Most people today see snow as one uniform substance. It is cold, it is white, and if there is enough of it, it causes traffic problems. Ancient humans living through subarctic and Arctic winters saw something completely different. They saw a layered archive of temperature history, wind behavior, animal movement, and structural information that could mean the difference between shelter and death. There are at least a dozen distinct types of snow that indigenous Arctic peoples identified and named separately, not because they enjoyed vocabulary, but because each type behaved differently under a sled, under a boot, under a shelter wall, and under the body of a sleeping person. Wind slab, for example, is a compacted layer formed when wind drives snow into a hard crust. It is excellent for cutting blocks to build a wind wall. Sugar snow, or depth hoar, is the crystallized loose layer that forms near the ground when temperature gradients are steep. It is dangerous under a sled and deadly under a snow shelter because it collapses without warning. Knowing which was which, by touch, by sound when you pressed it, by the way it fractured under a blade, was not optional knowledge. It was survival literacy. Number 19 is building a quinsy or debris shelter that generates its own heat. Before the igloo, before permanent lodges, there was the emergency snow shelter and the debris hut. Two structures that ancient humans could build in a few hours with nothing but their hands and what the landscape provided. A quinsy is made by piling loose snow into a dome shape about 8 feet across, letting it sinter for 2 hours so the crystals bond together, then hollowing it out from the inside to a shell thickness of about 4 inches. The result is a structure that holds an internal temperature around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures drop to -40. The body heat of one person sleeping inside raises that temperature enough to be genuinely comfortable. The debris hut works on a different principle, using dead leaves, dry grass, pine needles, and branches to create an insulating layer 2 feet thick on all sides. Both shelters share one critical feature that modern people almost never think about. The entrance is always lower than the sleeping area, because cold air sinks and warm air rises. And a sleeping platform just 18 inches off the ground can be 15 degrees warmer than the floor. Number 18 is rendering fat and understanding why it was more valuable than meat. In a cold environment, the human body burns through calories at a rate that would shock most people living in the modern world. Staying warm requires fuel, and the densest fuel available to ancient humans was animal fat. A pound of rendered fat contains more than twice the calories of a pound of lean protein, and it stores through winter without refrigeration in cold climates. Ancient peoples across the world developed rendering techniques that extracted and purified fat from bone marrow, subcutaneous deposits, and organ tissue. They rendered it slowly over low heat to remove water and impurities, stored it in bladders or sealed clay vessels, and mixed it with dried meat and berries to create pemmican, a food that explorers and military forces were still relying on well into the 20th century. The ability to read an animal carcass and extract every calorie it contained, including cracking femur bones to get at the marrow, was a skill passed from parent to child as carefully as any language. Number 17 is tracking animals in winter conditions without losing the trail. Snow is a gift for trackers and a death sentence for the unskilled. Fresh tracks in soft snow are obvious, but ancient hunters needed to read tracks in wind-blown conditions, on ice, across rock where snow barely accumulated, and in the early stages of melt and refreeze that distort track shape entirely. They learned to identify animals not just by print shape, but by stride length, gait pattern, the depth asymmetry between front and back feet, the drag marks of a tail or belly, and the behavioral signatures embedded in the path itself. A deer moving in a relaxed straight line through a forest means something completely different from the same deer making sharp turns and sudden stops. A predator track circling a depression in the snow near a creek tells a skilled tracker that something bedded there within the last 12 hours. These were not observations that took years to learn in an abstract sense. They were observations that became automatic through a childhood spent with eyes on the ground. Number 16 is using fire in ways that go far beyond warmth. Everyone knows fire keeps you warm. What most people do not know is the elaborate set of secondary applications that ancient humans developed around fire that made it a survival multiplier rather than just a heat source. Rock boiling is one example. Dropping fire-heated stones into a water-filled vessel made from bark, hide, or a wooden bowl allowed ancient peoples to boil water and cook food without any container that could go directly over flame. This was critical because the most available containers in a winter environment were organic and could not survive direct fire. Signal fires built with wet wood and green branches sent columns of smoke visible for miles in still air. Fire was used to heat rocks that were then buried under sleeping areas to provide hours of radiant warmth. Hot coals carried in a wrapped bundle of punkwood, a slow-burning fungal material, could be kept alive for days while traveling. The skill was not just starting fire, it was maintaining, transporting, and deploying fire across a dozen different applications without wasting a single ember. Number 15 is making and using rawhide in temperatures that modern materials fail. Below a certain temperature, modern synthetic materials become brittle, crack, and fail. Rawhide, processed animal skin that has been de-haired, stretched and dried without tanning, becomes rock-hard when dry and supple when wet, and it was one of the most versatile materials available to people living through severe winters. Ancient craftspeople used rawhide for lashing, for snowshoe webbing, for container construction, for knife handles, and for binding tool heads to hafts. They knew that a joint bound with wet rawhide and allowed to dry in place would shrink and create a grip tighter than any modern mechanical fastener. They also knew that the same property could destroy a tool if rawhide got wet unexpectedly, so they waterproofed it with rendered fat. The skill of reading whether rawhide was too dry, too wet, or exactly right for a given application was developed over generations of very expensive failures. Number 14 is navigating by stars, snow patterns, and wind in whiteout conditions. A whiteout is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have. When snow covers the ground, snow fills the air, and clouds cover the sky, the horizon disappears entirely, and it becomes impossible to determine which way is up without an external reference. Ancient peoples who lived in these environments developed multiple overlapping navigation systems that did not rely on visibility. They knew which sides of trees accumulated more snow and why. They knew the prevailing wind direction in their region and could feel it through exposed skin, even when visibility was zero. They knew the position of the North Star and could find it through gaps in overcast sky. They knew the patterns of snowdrift formation relative to wind direction and could read drifts the way a sailor reads waves. The Inuit, among others, developed a word for a specific type of snow formation called a sastrugi, a wind-sculpted ridge that aligned predictably with the prevailing wind and served as a navigational reference across featureless terrain. If you have made it this far, and you are finding this as fascinating as I am, do me a favor and drop a comment below telling me which of these skills surprises you most. I read every single one. Let's keep going. Number 13 is reading predator behavior to avoid ambush rather than fight. Fighting a wolf, a bear, or a pack of wild dogs in winter conditions was not a strategy that ancient humans preferred. It was expensive in energy, dangerous in injury, and fatal if it went wrong. The preferred strategy was never being surprised in the first place, and that required understanding predator behavior well enough to predict it. Ancient hunters knew the territorial patterns of large predators in their region. They knew which times of day and which weather conditions increased predatory activity. They knew the alarm calls of birds and the behavior changes of smaller animals that signaled a predator in the area before any human eye could see it. They knew to avoid the areas near fresh carcasses where a predator might return, and they knew that moving through deep snow in single file reduced the energy expenditure of the group, while also reducing the visual and acoustic signature they presented to anything watching from the tree line. Avoidance was the skill. Fighting was the failure mode. Number 12 is preserving food through fermentation in sub-zero conditions. Modern people associate fermentation with yogurt, beer, and sourdough bread, pleasant additions to an already adequate diet. For ancient humans in cold climates, fermentation was a primary food preservation technology that operated through winter and provided nutrients that no other preservation method could replicate. Certain fermented fish preparations from Arctic cultures, aged in sealed containers underground, are among the most nutritionally dense foods ever analyzed. The process is not rotting. The process is controlled bacterial transformation that produces acids, alcohols, and B vitamins, particularly B12, that are otherwise difficult to obtain through a winter diet. The knowledge of which containers to use, which temperatures allowed safe fermentation versus dangerous putrefaction, and which signs indicated a batch had gone wrong was not guesswork. It was applied microbiology developed through thousands of years of experimentation with very high stakes for getting it wrong. Number 11 is making and repairing tools with stone, bone, and antler in freezing conditions. Fingers lose dexterity at low temperatures faster than most people realize. The fine motor control required to flake obsidian or chert into a usable cutting edge is significant under any conditions. Doing it when your fingers are stiff and your breath is fogging the air in front of you is a serious skill challenge. Ancient knappers knew to warm stones carefully and gradually before working them, because thermal shock could ruin a piece of material in an instant. They knew which stone types were available in winter and which could not be worked in cold. They used pressure flaking techniques with antler tines to produce razor-sharp edges with more control than percussion allowed. They maintained their tools obsessively, because a broken blade in winter with no way to replace it quickly was not an inconvenience. It was a cascade of problems that could end a life. Number 10 is using dogs as a survival technology rather than just companions. The domestication of dogs is estimated to have begun somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, and one of the earliest and most important applications was not hunting. It was thermal regulation. A dog sleeping against a human body in a cold environment transfers significant heat. Indigenous peoples in subarctic regions used dogs as living blankets, and the phrase, a three-dog night, meaning a night cold enough to require 3 dogs sleeping against you for warmth, is an expression with genuine survival mathematics behind it. Dogs also functioned as early warning systems for predators, as scouts for game, as pack animals across snow, and as emergency food in the most extreme circumstances. Managing a group of working dogs through a winter, maintaining their health, their discipline, and their working relationships with each other was a specialized skill that took years to develop and was one of the most valuable things a person in a cold climate culture could know how to do. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a great time. We are getting into the skills that will genuinely change how you see human history. Number 9 is making waterproof clothing from skin and gut membrane. The thermal properties of modern synthetic insulation are impressive, but the complete waterproofing achieved by ancient peoples using animal intestine, stomach lining, and treated skin was something that modern gear has only recently been able to match, and only at significant cost. The Inuit kamleka, a parka made from the split and sewn intestines of seals or sea lions, was so waterproof it could be submerged and remain dry inside. The sewing technique used gut thread that swelled when wet, sealing its own needle holes. Every seam was constructed so that water running down the outside would be directed away from the body rather than toward it. The women who made these garments were regarded as possessing a specialized technical knowledge that was fully equal in value to the hunting skills of the men who wore them. A hunter with a poorly made parka was a dead hunter. The knowledge lived in hands as much as in minds. Number 8 is reading the sky for weather prediction up to 48 hours out. Before barometers, before weather satellites, before radar, ancient peoples developed observational weather prediction systems that were accurate enough to save lives. They knew that a ring around the moon indicated moisture in the upper atmosphere and predicted precipitation within 24 to 48 hours. They knew specific cloud formations that preceded storm systems and could read the progression of cirrus to altostratus to nimbostratus as a timeline for incoming weather. They knew wind shift patterns that preceded cold fronts. They knew the smell of incoming snow, a real phenomenon caused by the drop in airborne particulates as cold, dry air moves in ahead of a storm. They knew that animals behaved differently in the hours before a major weather event, and that watching a herd, a flock, or even a colony of insects could give as much warning as watching the sky. This knowledge was not mystical. It was applied atmospheric science developed through direct observation over thousands of years. Number 7 is building fire from friction in wet and freezing conditions. The bow drill, the hand drill, the fire plow. These are the methods that people learn about in survival courses and then discover are far harder than they appeared. What they almost never learn is what ancient peoples knew absolutely. The wood combination matters more than the technique. The moisture content of the wood matters more than the speed. The notch geometry matters more than the pressure. And in winter conditions with frozen fingers and ambient humidity that prevents wood from drying properly, the entire skill set changes. Ancient peoples in cold climates kept their fire-starting materials in the driest, warmest place available, often next to their bodies. They knew which tree species in their region produced the lowest ignition temperature and which produced the most durable ember. They knew how to prepare tinder from dried fungi, shredded bark, and dried grass into a bundle that would catch a spark on the first attempt, because in winter, in the cold, there was often no second attempt available. The firebow was not a primitive tool. It was precision technology. Number 6 is using medicinal plants through winter when most are dormant or buried. Winter kills the visible parts of most plants. The roots, the bark, and the dried seed heads remain. Ancient healers knew exactly where to find medicine when the landscape looked dead. They knew which tree barks contained compounds that reduced fever and pain, an observation that eventually led to the development of aspirin. They knew which dried berries retained antiviral properties through winter storage. They knew which root systems could be harvested from frozen ground and which needed to be dried in autumn for winter use. They knew how to make poultices from materials available in the coldest months that would prevent wound infection in an era before antibiotics, when a deep cut or a frostbitten finger that became infected was a death sentence that operated on a timeline of days. This was not folk superstition. Ethnobotanical research has validated the pharmacological activity of many of these plants at levels that explain their effectiveness clearly. Number 5 is managing group energy through winter to prevent fatal exhaustion. Cold weather does not kill people instantly in most cases. It kills them through a cascade of decisions made when the body and mind are already depleted. Ancient leaders of winter expeditions and winter camps understood this in ways that modern survival trainers still teach as foundational principles. They knew that letting the weakest member of a group fall too far behind created a compounding problem that could kill the whole group because a member in distress generates panic, slows decision-making, and consumes rescue resources that everyone else needed for their own survival. They rationed not just food, but effort, always keeping a reserve of energy that could be deployed for emergencies. They built rest cycles into travel that felt inefficient to outsiders, but were specifically calibrated to prevent the kind of exhaustion that causes falls, bad decisions, and hypothermia. They understood the relationship between caloric intake, exertion, and core body temperature maintenance well enough to manage it across days of continuous travel through difficult terrain. Number 4 is making rope, cord, and webbing from plant and animal fiber in winter. Nothing in ancient survival technology works without the ability to bind, lash, carry, and construct. and all of those functions require cordage. The problem in winter is that the primary plant sources for cordage fibers are either frozen, buried under snow, or dead. Ancient craftspeople solved this through a combination of preparation and substitution. They prepared large quantities of cordage in autumn from plant fibers like nettle, dogbane, and inner bark of certain trees. They supplemented this in winter with animal sources that remained available: sinew from fresh kills, rawhide strips, and the long guard hairs of certain animals that could be spun into strong cordage with a drop spindle. The twisted two-ply construction used for most ancient cordage is still the strongest structure per unit of material that physics allows for flexible rope, a fact that materials engineers have confirmed mathematically. It was not discovered by accident. It was the product of systematic testing over thousands of years. Number 3 is using snow itself as an insulator rather than an enemy. Here is the thing that changes how most people think about winter survival when they first hear it. Snow is one of the best insulating materials available in a cold environment. Its thermal conductivity is low enough that the ground under a deep snowpack stays close to freezing, even when air temperatures are 40 or 50 degrees below that. This is why small mammals survive winter by burrowing under snow rather than fighting it. Ancient peoples understood and applied this principle in ways that go far beyond building snow shelters. They buried food caches under snow to keep them at a stable temperature rather than the extreme cold above the surface. They cached seeds in the snowpack. They wrapped patients with hypothermia in snow shelters rather than exposing them to wind. They understood that wind chill is the primary killer in cold environments, not ambient temperature alone, and that any layer between skin and moving air, even a layer of packed snow, was a life-saving barrier. The material you almost certainly have in your home right now that shares this property is styrofoam, a material that works on the same trapped air principle that makes snow such an effective insulator. Every time you see a coffee cup made of it, you are looking at ancient thermodynamic knowledge in a modern form. Number 2 is communicating survival information across languages and generations through story and symbol. This is perhaps the most underappreciated survival technology in human history. The specific techniques on this list took tens of thousands of years to develop and test. They worked. The question of how to transmit them reliably across generations that might never read or write, across groups that spoke different languages, across distances that made direct instruction impossible, was not a problem that ancient peoples left to chance. They developed redundant transmission systems. Stories embedded survival information in narrative structures so memorable and emotionally engaging that they survived oral transmission across hundreds of generations without significant distortion, a fact confirmed when archaeologists decode ancient myths and find accurate astronomical, geological, and ecological information inside them. Symbols carved into rock, painted onto cave walls, and inscribed on tools served as mnemonic devices for people who already knew the information and as initiating prompts for those learning it. The same techniques that made information stick across 1,000 years of oral transmission are the same techniques that make information stick in a human brain today: narrative, emotional resonance, repetition, and sensory detail. The format of this video is not an accident, and now we have reached number 1. The single skill that ancient humans developed above all others, the one that made every other skill on this list possible, the one that modern people have lost more completely than any physical technique, and the one that researchers studying ancient human cognition consistently identify as the primary driver of our species' survival through conditions that should have killed us entirely. That skill is patient attention, not passive observation, not merely watching, but the disciplined practice of sustained, focused attention to one thing long enough to understand it at a level that changes how you interact with it forever. Our ancestors had no entertainment competing for their attention. They had no notifications, no infinite scrolling, no engineered dopamine systems optimized to keep them from focusing on anything long enough to understand it deeply. What they had was necessity. When your life depends on understanding how snow compresses under a blade, you pay attention to snow compressing under a blade until you understand every variable involved. When your life depends on reading the behavioral signals of a predator you cannot yet see, you develop the capacity to sustain attention on a set of subtle environmental cues for hours without distraction. The survival advantage of this kind of attention was not metaphorical. Studies of modern forager groups and indigenous peoples who still practice traditional winter survival techniques show consistently that the most experienced practitioners of these skills share a capacity for sustained, non-distracted attention that is measurably different from people raised in modern urban environments. They are not smarter. They are better at paying attention, for longer, to things that matter. Every skill on this list is nested inside that one. Without it, none of the others develop to the level that actually keeps you alive. The knowledge of which wood to use for a bow drill is useless if you cannot pay attention long enough to feel when the friction point is exactly right. The ability to read snow is useless if your attention keeps jumping to the next thing before the current thing has told you everything it has to say. Patient attention was not a personality trait among ancient humans. It was a survival technology, practiced daily, taught deliberately, and treated as the foundation of every other form of competence a person could develop. It is the most forgotten skill on this list, and it is the one that, if we recovered it, would change everything else. These 20 skills were not developed by exceptional people. They were developed by ordinary people in extraordinary conditions who had no choice but to get them right. The world they lived in did not grade on a curve. It did not accept almost right. It accepted competence, or it removed you from the next generation's story entirely. Every time you see a snow-covered landscape this winter, every time you feel cold air on your face, know that your ancestors walked through conditions like that for 10,000 generations and came out the other side with more knowledge than we have preserved. So here is the challenge I want to leave you with today. Pick one skill from this list, just one, and spend 1 hour this week actually learning something concrete about it. Not watching a video about it, not reading a summary. Actually getting your hands on the material or the technique or the concept in a way that requires your full attention for a sustained period of time. Tell me in the comments which one you picked and what you found out. I will be reading every comment, and I will feature the most interesting responses in the next video. If this kind of deep dive into forgotten human knowledge is what you are here for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we go this deep every week. See you in the next one.